I said to them, the quote needs to be twice it was. And they said, there's no ways the client will accept it. I said, but that's the effort that you put in to deliver that quality project, which you said they actually want that quality deliverable. This is what it costs, I think we do go back to that central estimate, and I think we do perhaps bias ourselves when we're working to result solutions that we think fit the mold, even though every project is unique. I'm not sure we challenge ourselves enough, but if we challenge ourselves, we're going to blow that fairly tight budget.
Hello, sorry for what's going to be a slightly lengthier introduction than usual. I just have to set the context for this chat a little bit more than I usually do, because usually we have these lengthy introductions to people and it's all good fun to learn about people's career. But in this conversation, we kind of dive straight in. So I just want to do this little preamble from my sort of comfortable seat back in my office here at home. So I apologize, the background with sheep. If you've heard me talk on this channel about things like mining and exploration project failure, and that's quite an interesting topic. Why do they happen and how do we prevent them? Yada, yada. We talked about this quite a bit, and it's really important conversation to have as we all look to make the industry a better place and so on. But rather than spending more time in that particular rabbit hole from a technical perspective, I thought it would be interesting to see how, as consultants, we deal with that. Because, okay, we have these cognitive biases, and as humans, we tend to plan everything wrong and over budget and over time, right? We know this is a known fact. So do we then have an obligation to be better at this than others or than our clients? Or do we accept that these things just go over budget sometimes and deal with whatever comes next? So I reflected on our own way of working here. I mean, sometimes we know that there's a reasonable chance that something goes over budget. But if we would include all the unknown unknowns at the 99.9% percentile into our quotes, nothing would ever get signed off and approved, right? So this principle is called strategic misrepresentation, a well-known trick not only in consulting land, but also in local councils or anywhere where politics are involved and projects need to be approved. So I asked myself, are we as consultants actually good at planning stuff, these projects, and should we eat some humble pie here? What is our role and responsibility in all of this? So in this chat, I put it to some leaders of our consulting world to see what they think about all of this and whether this is even on their radar or not. In this chat, I therefore sit down with Tarrant Elkington, who is this GM at Snowden Optiro Consultants, with Andrew Hall, MD at AMC Consultants, and with Mark Noppé, who's the ex-CEO of XSTRACT Consultants and the chair of SRK. And after we tackle this whole planning fallacy issue, we drift into some other lessons learned in consulting, which could be fun for people who don't know too much about how consultants work. It was a great, fun chat to sort of hang out with my colleagues here, and maybe there are some interesting things in there for others that don't know too much about this world or who are considering a career in consulting. So now I bring you Tarrant Elkington, Andrew Hall, and Mark Noppé. Hope you enjoy. This all comes out of it comes out of previous conversations that I had on the channel, right? And I'll set this context a little bit more officially in a minute. But effectively, it comes out of a bit of a journey, right? Because I never really thought about the philosophy or the psychology of project management very much. And then you start talking to a few people and you go, that's interesting. I got past this book by a friend a couple of years ago, and I've talked about it on the channel before. And there's this book here, and I'll just flash it. But the book is called How Big Things Get Done, and written by Flyvbjerg. And it was really kind of a watershed moment for me, because a lot of the things in there you kind of intuitively know, but they are very well articulated, and it's all about how projects fail. I think the key thing that I wanted to chat to you guys about, and I thought that could be fun, is, okay, we know that projects fail, right? Great story, and people have looked at that for years. And even in our industry, there are quite a few people who have looked at this before. And the engineers, there's 2 engineers in the call here, and 2 geologists. So you probably know a little bit more about this because these articles have been written by engineers. And I've got something here by Sam McLeod in 2021, feasibility studies for novel and complex projects. He talks about this. And there's something by Edward Holloway. He had a piece on the AusIMM magazine in May 2024 of risk and planning not to plan. And, and I know people like Alan Trench have talked about this before. I had him on the channel. We did discuss this. And I also had Andrew Gillis on the channel, and he has written a paper on this as well. So all of this kind of, coalesced, and I was like, have I just been living under a rock with all of this stuff? And, so the principle of this call isn't to point out, why projects fail and how we can do better as an industry, because I think that is an interesting discussion. And I did have that on the channel with some of these people. And I genuinely think that this is the place where we can make advancements. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the chat that I had with Steve Beresford not too long ago, but he also pointed out that all of this is, it's people, right? And it's how people think and act that make things work. So then the thought struck me, well, this is all well and good that these projects fail. And if I would have a project, then I'd be interested in that. But then I thought, as a consultant, we work for companies that plan projects, and we plan our own projects, right? We write quotes. We write quotes for very, very tricky projects. And I thought it would be fun to sort of see how other people deal with this, let's call it a problem, right? A problem of, we know that this is unlikely to come in under budget. That's the angle to this, where I thought, all of this is about psychology. And again, the binding force here is this guy called Daniel Kahneman, and I've referenced him a number of times in this, because I think there's a dialogue here. So that's the scene and the context. But I just wanted to kick that around, and in particular, is this something, maybe just as a general question to get us going? And as leaders of your consultancies, or, Mark, in your case, you've obviously led consultancies, XSTRACT and SRK, you've worked for Snowden's and so on, so consulting is not new to you. What for you guys, how do you look at this component, or do you just write proposals the way you do every day, and the next one you try to make a little bit better? Or is there actually, do you sit around a table and discuss this within your company? And is this, these cognitive biases, are these things that you're aware of and weaving into your business strategies, in the ways you work? That was sort of an overarching question. So
it's interesting because you talk about projects, but even the business we run internally, these are projects, right?
Yeah.
So there's client projects and then there's our own projects. And I guess part of the interesting question for ourselves would be, when we look at how we plan to set up a new office or our business, which is a project and a plan, do we follow the same logic and processes we do when we look to, develop a proposal and put something together for an external project for a client? So I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. But I think the other one that frames a little bit of how we approach a client's project, whether it be small or large, right? I mean, we all work on either small repeat business type projects, multiple, or we try for the bigger, longer term projects, is, are we thinking of them as our projects, or are we thinking of as the client project? Are we thinking of ourselves as part of the team? And if we're thinking of it as part of the team, do we still see ourselves as the independent, honest broker? And I guess I'm raising that one because I had a stint working internally in a large company where I was part of an internal tech services, and we were essentially internal consultants to the broader business. And we did see ourselves as independent, trying to get it right for the business, informing the technical director of the merits of projects. And I think that makes a difference, is the lens that you put on when you look at it. And then the other one as a consultant is, are we trying to win the business and come in, as we often do, with this is our best possible, well, I guess we'd call it the baseline quote, right? The assuming everything goes right and assuming that the scope is correct. This is what we think needs to be done and how long it will take. Whereas we know the same as building a project, it tends to go over. There's things you've overlooked. But we don't necessarily build all of that into, I sense, into our proposals, other than we may list them from a point of view of heads up, these are my assumptions. In other words, there's a lot that I don't have and I might list them. But we almost always know that they're going to occur. And I just wonder if we build insufficient discussion time, including with the client, to take them on the journey, to really discuss what's required and say, look, it's all very well, so long as you include a variation in your assumptions, we know that it's going to come. We know it's going to happen. We don't necessarily know where. Same as a project build-up.
But that's not always easy, because I think not everybody on the other side is perhaps able to interpret how you or the problems that you have as a consultant to set that up. Not everybody is experienced with. They might have managed projects, but I always call that manager consultant, right? There is an interaction that you need to have with the consulting group to allow that to take place. And the first call that you have with somebody, you always hope indeed that you can go through that journey, that you can really work together to solve that. Because I think what you just put on the table there, and I this was one of the things I wrote down as well, is this principle of strategic misrepresentation. You know that it's going to cost more money, right? And if you put that quote on the table, that this is what it's going to cost, and then build in a bit of extra fat as well for unknown unknowns and all those things, then the project will never get signed. So that creates a little bit of a tricky situation for consultants, because sometimes you can't win with that, I presume. Do the others have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. In terms of, you're talking about writing a proposal, well, the first stage is to get that scope right and I guess understand what problem the client's wanting to solve. In an ideal world, you're part of that scoping process and collaborating with all the other disciplines and stakeholders to make sure that you've got that scope of work right to answer the question, the problem that the client wants to be solved. And sometimes that can be small, and it might be a small scope of work initially to answer a specific question, or it could be much broader in terms of overall project evaluation and feasibility. For me, it's that communication, that collaboration, and having more of a partnership in developing a scope of work often leads to a better outcome. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that's not how it often works.
Yeah. Well, and before maybe Tarrant jumps in, I mean, the other thing is that we might think with our cognitive biases that we have all the answers, but I think Bent in his book makes a clear point that this is not just a realm of somebody building a new kitchen or building a train station or something like that. These fallacies are also definitely present with consultants. And there's a few quotes in the book that I found quite interesting that are quite sobering. And maybe to set the tone for people listening, just run some quick statistics. So this guy has done, what was it, 16,000 projects he analyzed or something like that. And it's a significant amount. And he says of all projects, only 48 are on budget. 8.5% are on budget and on time, and only 0.5% are on time, on budget, and actually deliver on the benefits. And I don't think that's necessarily just our clients, to put it like that, because I joked the other day on the channel. I put a little outside basketball field in my house, and I thought I'd get it done in 20 grand, but here we are 38 grand later and it's still not done, and I think, shit, I'm good at this. Why didn't I get this right? So, you know what I'm saying? So even with all the good intentions and all that discussion with the client, you still collectively have to be aware of these cognitive biases. What are you thinking, Tarrant?
Well, I mean, I was thinking about this a bit, and I guess in general, where we would try to land on a proposal, and it might not be the right approach, is for the scope that you've given. We're trying to figure out what's the most likely value that you're going to land at. So we, maybe others do it differently, but we're not thinking that we're going to go in and be asking for variations and things like that, unless the scope, unless they say we want to estimate another deposit, we need to rerun the whole mine plan again because some additional data's come in, things like that. We want to try to land where that estimate is, or within that estimate for the scope of work. And generally we do. do that. And I think from my experience, clients also often hold you to that, and maybe we're not doing the right approach in getting enough variations and things like that. But I think that clients, with the way that purchase orders work these days and things like that, you have these time and materials projects, but they're not fixed, but they're fixed in a way, right?
Yeah.
Because of the way procurement works and whatnot. So you've got to be, I think you've got to put enough in there, and for us, if that means sometimes we'll lose because if somebody's gone about it the other way, then I guess so be it.
Right.
But I think the some things that make that there, or maybe we could talk about it a bit more, but there's some things that make that difficult to achieve sometimes. And they're probably the more interesting parts, I think.
Yeah, well, we can cover that, but I think Mark wants to jump in there. So, yeah.
Yeah, one of the other things, and it would be interesting, yourself, Andrew and Tarrant, but generally in our business, 80% of the work or the inquiries we have are repeat clients, like they're not new. That means we have some relationship with them. Do we actually reach out sufficiently to have that discussion, when we receive a scope of work, to say, is this actually what you want? Like, what do you actually want out of this? Can we just try and understand it? Because I've sat in meetings with my own consulting staff at different times where they've begun to interpret a scope of work in a way that I had to bring them back and say, look, I don't read in this scope or these queries, or in having the client around the table. I'm not hearing what you interpret in. You put in your own absolute bias on what you think they want, and we need to double check with the client before we go too far. But I reflect that we never had sufficient conversations with the client at that early stage, although many of us, I'm sure, reach out for those discussions. Yeah. And also the modern way, the mention was there of how we now contract through purchase orders and procurement. We may be having a great conversation with the technical leads who we know, but once we split that up into a technical versus commercial proposal, we tend to get really frustrated with the process.
So can I just jump in on that one? Because I made a note here as well, because something that we've been discussing with RSC for years now is basically the principle that your best technical people do not necessarily have to be the best project managers, and vice versa. And depending on how you structure your jobs, your consulting jobs, you could, and the same goes for the client, right? Because you might be talking to the technical expert for that domain that you're consulting on, and sometimes they are also the project managers, but it doesn't have to be the case. But it's quite important because both groups of people think about these jobs in a different way. And we've structured our jobs more and more to be to have these project managers have a really good, strong input early on, so that the skills are in the right place, because not everybody looks at the job the same way. But that obviously means there are extra costs involved, because you need to make sure you got the right people in the right seats and so on. Are all your it's not the right question, but are all your technical people automatically also your project managers? How do you look at that in your businesses, Andrew?
Yeah, no, certainly not. It obviously depends on the complexity, size of the project. If it's someone's project managing themselves and they're a specialist at what they do, well, they run with it. But it's a completely different skill set in terms of project managing a larger multidiscipline project. And I guess I touched on before, and probably will throughout the course of the podcast, is really around communication for project managers, which is so important. They've got to bring all of the disciplines together, whereas one particular discipline, one particular specialist may have a greater bias in terms of the work that they're doing and the impact that that's going to have on project value. So I guess it's bringing all of those disciplines together, making sure that they're communicating and talking is ultimately going to lead to the best outcome.
So I think so. You can only agree with that, because that's obviously crystal clear that has to be the case. But coming back to what you were saying, Mark, because obviously communication needs to be there, and the scope is so important, right? How that scope is written and what's in there, and that we all agree on that is critical. But that doesn't necessarily get you to the right quote. And then coming back to what you were saying, Tarrant, I get that you don't want to work with variations. Nobody wants to work with variations because they're frustrating and it just feels like you haven't estimated it right. But is that quote that you're giving a P50, a P70, P90, P95? To what degree? So the book talks about anchoring, right? And it's a well-known studied effect, and marketers work with the principles of anchoring as well. And I wrote it down so I can get the wording right. But anchoring and adjustment is kind of what we're talking about here, particularly when immediate experience is used as the anchor, is a natural way of thinking. And psychologists have shown that the final estimates are biased towards the anchor. Quality of the anchor is therefore critical. So with the anchor is indeed the recent experience of that job that you had that went right or wrong. That's your anchor, and then you multiply. You have this factor that you build on top of that to come up with your ultimate quote. And what they've demonstrated in multiple industries is that bias leans towards that anchor, and therefore you're undercalling your estimates. That's sort of how I read that. But to make my point out of that, coming to both to what you both just said, you want to send that proposal, and yes, if you miss out because somebody has a different way of doing it, that's fine. But to what degree? Because as Ben demonstrates in the book, these projects, the cost of these, the outcomes are heavily skewed. And I think we all got some experience with skewed distributions, meaning to say, if you send a quote for that median, that P50, if you like, you're going to get burned. So maybe just to poke in that again, Tarrant, on what you said, do you feel like the quotes that you're sending are building in that anchor, if you like, and that you are aware of that anchor bias and that you're therefore sitting quite high? And then as a follow-up question, does anybody, in this group hold a database of those anchors, right? Because yes, you have all the previous quotes that you send, but is there a feedback loop happening, that iteration that is discussed heavily in the book as well, to create that feedback loop of people saying, hey, look, guys, last time this didn't go so right because all of these the data quality or something like that, every time, or geological complexity, that old chestnut, how do you capture that? So sorry, a bit of a rant, but just a couple of things there that I just wanted to pick on. So maybe back to you, Tarrant.
Well, I think that you've got risks a lot on the first time that you work on a project or with a new client. I think there's a lot of learning there as towards the data issues you're talking about, which is a big side of things, and just the unknowns of who you're dealing with. But as Mark said, often in our business, it's, like 80% return customers. So, and often it's updating things that you've done before. So there's quite a few projects that fit into the box of we've done it before, we're just going to do it again. Right. So I think there's enough data points, and as the book talks to the reference class, yes, that there's enough in the reference class. Do we have a database? Well, I guess, yes, we've got a database of all of the billings that we put into projects in the past. Do we formally use it, or we assess each one individually and then see where it sits in the range? Then I think that's generally would be our approach. I think there's different projects that we work on. Like, the very big projects are the hardest ones. Maybe Andrew probably could comment to that too. So the large feasibility studies or things, multidisciplinary jobs can be like a big range because the total is much higher. But for, like, as you do, Rene, resource estimates and things like that, you generally know there's a range depending on the complexity and commodity and whatnot of where you think that it'll land. But P50, I'm not sure. I think we as a business, that there's probably people that work more hours than they actually put against the project to deliver, right? So it's kind of like that, a bit of that hidden cost that says you deliver, but you take some pain on that side as well.
Certainly, my sense over multiple consulting companies was that we tend to go to that central previous estimate of we keep thinking that it's going to work the way we'd like it to work. So that anchor bias, I think, pulls us back.
Yeah.
Because if we truly built in, Tarrant, to your point, that we know some people have to burn many extra hours in order to come in closer to the original budget, and we do it repeatedly. I can remember some case studies where I analyzed what somebody actually did. I said to them, the quote needs to be twice it was, and they said, there's no ways the client will accept it. I said,
Exactly.
but that's the effort that you put in to deliver that quality project, which you said they actually want that quality deliverable. This is what it costs, So, I think we do go back to that central estimate, and I think we do perhaps bias ourselves when we're working to result solutions that we think fit the mold, even though every project is unique. I'm not sure we challenge ourselves enough, but if we challenge ourselves, we're going to blow that fairly tight budget and quote. So that's a risk we have. I think one of the things I'm not sure we do, and it'd be good to hear from yourselves, is do we have sufficient feedback loops with the client in terms of weekly or bi-weekly feedback saying, this is what I did, this is what I found, this is what I think. I think we need to vary this, go this, do that. Do we have those conversations? All of you know Phil Snowden, or remember Phil Snowden. The best advice he gave me many good bits of advice, but one of them was give news early. Bad news, good news, give it early. Nobody likes a surprise. We can't deal with surprises, but we can deal with something when it's on the table. And I always strive to do that. Don't always get it right.
I remember that you said this years ago. So the No Surprise is one of my favorite songs, and I keep saying this on the channel, but also one of the best consulting advices. And I shout it to these walls here quite often. So Andrew?
I think, and Mark and Darren both touched on something I think that's, the really important there is that I don't think we communicate early enough with clients. And often, because we want to do the best job we possibly can, we go and start doing a whole lot of other work to do it as best as possible, rather than making the question or asking the question, is it fit for purpose? Is this really, does the client want to go down this path? And maybe if they did, then we could talk to them about the variations or the change, whereas we can still deliver to the scope of work and the quality, perhaps sometimes doing less work than we want to do. So it's around having that discussion, and sometimes that it's not necessary to do the best possible technical piece of work for a particular scope and to solve a particular problem. Right. That I think the type of people that are attracted to consultancy are subject matter experts, and they love doing the technical work. So sometimes they do head down that rabbit warren.
Yeah, well, that's what we talked about before, right? Because some people are really good at what they do, but they just want to close the door, be left alone. And when they're done with it, they'll come out and show you their good work. And then, 9 times out of 10, that might be great, but if they don't communicate that along the way. But even so, I was just hearing Tarrant talking, and after Mark followed up, I was thinking, we recently had a project where, because we sent weekly updates to our clients in small weekly reports, sometimes emails, and we try to follow those up with calls. But obviously all that is billable time, so not everybody likes that, because it looks like you're being a lawyer, right? Trying to find a 7-minute block of time to ring your client to charge them another $15. But it's important. But we sometimes notice, even after all of that communication, and you said from halfway through, hey guys, this looks like it's there's some unknown unknowns that have popped up, some geological variability here, some stuff with the data that we weren't anticipating. I want to come back to that one. It's probably going to go over a little bit, right? And there's no surprises, but still at the end there is that resentment feeling that you get. And it doesn't happen often, but you think, we're here all of the way, and it's because of that quote that we send at the end. I'm sure it's the same in your business. It's an estimate, right? And it's an estimate for all the reasons that we just discussed. And I guess, it's more of a statement rather than a question, but perhaps as a question to you guys, What do you do in those jurisdictions that just don't want an estimate, right? And there is a few very specific parts of the world, or if you work for governments or something like that, those kind of jobs where they want a fixed quote estimate, and there's all these unknowns, and it's a tricky jurisdiction, and that's difficult. But there are big jobs, and sometimes, even though you have 80% return business, you really want that big job, because we can't live off 3-week little resource jobs, right? That doesn't pay the bills. It's these bigger ones. So you've got to have to make a concession. And any words of wisdom on fixed cost projects that you run? You avoid them like the plague, or you just layer it up and and just hope for the best?
So certainly, here in Australia, more often than not, we were doing the time and expense type estimates that people treated as a fixed quote, even though it's not. So we've discussed that point. But other jurisdictions, as you say, don't always work that way. And in fact, there's many of them. And one of the lessons is, do you know people, or do you have a local office in that region who is used to working that way? And have that discussion on how does this work?
Yeah.
And, I'm in more recently, I found myself in a situation where this is more common than not. And it took me, a good while to get around how we do these fixed prices. But there's a fixed lot of money, there's work to be done, there's a scope to deliver. Sticking to the cloth is hard, and we've already discussed people working out of scope. Mm-hmm. But working with people who are used to doing that, taking advice, it definitely helps, because there's stage gates. The other thing I find, and I won't say it's more common, but I've seen examples where in some of those jurisdictions, the client's got a fair idea what they want. And when you don't actually give them what they want because you're thinking outside the square for solutions, they actually don't like your answer, which makes it tricky for their payment milestones, because you get paid on milestones, right? Mm-hmm. And the other one, I'll just share this anecdote. Working in a jurisdiction like that many years ago, we were trying to get the final payment from the milestone for a fixed price quote. Yep. And an advisor who was on the project but off to the side, but was used to it, said, "Did you not work out a price, double it, and ask for half in advance, because getting that last invoice was going to be difficult? And then when you pursued that client for the last invoice, were you surprised that they were fighting back so hard, because they actually thought you were ripping them off because you'd already got half in advance, which was what you expected. And if you didn't quote that way, you're the problem, not them."
Yeah. I'm sure there's a few lessons learned there, but it's difficult with these fixed costs, and and others want to jump in on that. I'm not sure how you guys are dealing with that.
I guess we've gone probably full circle on that. So historically, we were always time and materials, and then we had a different management maybe 10 or so years ago, and we moved all of our projects to being fixed costs. I think pretty much all of them, like by our own, presentation. And that lasted a little while, and now we're back to definitely preferring time and materials. Yeah. I think it's an aligned. To me, it's more a aligned approach. But when you do come to fixed price, one thing we need to remember here is that when it's a fixed price project, it's for a scope of work. Right? There's nobody that, a fixed price should never be for infinite amount of work on anything that's vaguely related to whatever you're doing. So whatever we're doing, if the scope varies, there's a grounds for, a variation, regardless of whether it's fixed price or time and materials. So in my view, there's actually not a huge difference between the two types in practice.
Well, so that's really interesting. I want to hear what Andrew's to say about this, but just that raised a thought, because, if the scope is clear enough, then you can point out a scope variation just fine, but then that could get quite murky, because that's all paperwork and POs and whatnot, and, could get a little bit, just maybe some examples help here, but, we've just been involved with a resource job where you look at the data and you think, okay, well, I've got a reasonable appreciation of what's coming at me. We've seen these kind of things before. There might be some uncertainties in the data, but this should probably be a reasonable estimate, right? And we provide a range, because I think a range is a really sensible thing to do. It's almost as sensible as stating tonnage in great ranges for inferred resources. There, I said it. But that at least gives you some movement. And then, halfway through the project, suddenly it looks like with the density, there are a few things that you really do need to spend a little bit more time on, and some additional tests need to be run. And, there's hours going into that, hours of discussion. And at some point a variation is required, but it's not easy to look for a variation on everything that is slightly different. I mean, data quality is always, we build these proposals for these heavily data-related projects on one major premise, that what we get sent, and yes, we can look at it before the project starts, right? But if they're big projects, you're not going to spend 5 days trawling through the data. You're going to make an 80-20 assessment and say, look, if the data are clean, then yes, this should be an easy job. But that's not always the case. There's always these things that pop up, but it's interesting to hear that you've gone full circle, I guess, twice. I wasn't expecting that. So good to hear you come back to the price estimate, because I couldn't imagine a world of fixed estimates, to be honest. Of fixed costs, to be honest. But Andrew, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Tarrant there. It's really, if you're putting in a fixed price bid, it's about getting the scope work and be really clear about what you're going to do and what you're not. But again, I think it comes back to what's your relationship with the client like. If it's a general request for tender and you haven't worked with the client before, obviously there's more risk. And just because you're the fixed price job doesn't necessarily mean that you won't uncover errors in the data or inconsistencies and other work that needs to be undertaken and to put in a variation. So I guess it really comes back down to that relationship with the client and also communication. But if you don't have a good relationship with the client, if you know that it's not a sophisticated mining environment, if it's fixed price, best avoided.
So that's really interesting, right? Because, and Mark, I know I talked to you about this in the past, because it is all about that level of trust, because the moment you are sending invoices for hours worked, right? Now, we do very detailed timesheets because we believe in transparency, and I don't believe a lot of people do that, but you'll get all the timesheets with all the blocks of time at everything that we've done, because we believe that, we have to extend the first sort of, visible act of transparency. And I know the pros and cons to that, but we're quite deliberate with that, because we want to show indeed that we're not looking for time to charge the clients. And, I felt, we've been doing this for 20 years now, and you guys have been in this business longer than I have, but there has been in the past this anxiety, right? Because you're sitting there, you're working with a new client, and you're excited because it's a good client, big client, interesting project, whatever version of that. And you desperately want to be trusted to do all the right things that you think are the right things, and then you send an invoice for the time that you spend on this. But that might not be interpreted like that on the other side. So this trust thing, it is easily said, but very difficult to create, especially if you're working remotely. You can't stare people in the eyes over beer in a pub, right? Easier said than done, this trust thing. And I'm sure you guys got good examples of, of dealing with that, but I think you're right on the money there. It is all about that relationship. But I've always felt I will just be quite open about this. I've always felt a certain amount of anxiety around that. Because the book, sorry, I won't ramble on too long, but it talks about this Mace Hayes slowly, this festina lenta principle, right? Or just plan slow, execute fast. But that means at the start of this project, whatever project you've agreed to do on with a client, you've got to take some time to lay it out in front of you, to plan it properly. But then, are we going fast enough? Are we looking like we're wasting time? There's always a little bit of that sitting in the back of my mind. I've got to have some results to show, right? Oh, well, quickly, let's do this. You want to avoid that anxiety. Am I just rambling here, or is this something you guys can connect with?
I think there's always I can relate, because the real challenge, I think, of being a consultant is to come into to something where you're not there every day with every drill hole. You know, you're not the guy that knows the collar, location, what happened in each case. You're climbing every day when you've got a new job, you're climbing the knowledge ladder for this project, right? That other people have done, you know, and expected to be on the first call, you know, familiar with all of the intricacies and whatever. So I think it's a tough gig. Like it's really interesting because you get to see a lot of things, but it's also really challenging to be able to very quickly get up that knowledge ladder for that project in a short period of time. And I think that's a very hard thing for maybe sometimes clients don't fully appreciate, is the challenge of doing that. They expect, because we've signed your proposal now, you already know as much about our project as we do. And I think some, you know, the consultants generally do a fantastic job of getting up that, you know, that knowledge ladder, but it does take time. And as Andrew said, there's always more that you would want to do or, you know, like to be able to do to really like absorb that project to be the best possible result for that project, right? But the budget doesn't always allow that. So you need to be able to be good at pruning, you know, what's the items that I'm going to hit first and hit hardest, and what's the most important things, and what things can I, you know, look at later or reduce down.
Yeah.
I think, so just a couple of points, sort of spanning the fixed quote through to the deliverables, is one of them is around milestones, right? So even if you're doing a time and expense, have you building feedback loops, not just the weekly reports on progress and what I'm doing next week, but this is what I understood, this is what I've distilled, this is where I'm looking to go next. You know, does this resonate with you? Because as Tarrant said, you know, those people know their project and their data better than we do. So reflecting back to them, you know, did I understand correctly, is something I'm not sure we do that well, feedback loop. But in those fixed price quotes, definitely the milestone report backs and managing expectations. I don't think we've raised that in this discussion yet, but you know, what are your expectations? This is what I'm going to deliver. Will that meet them? Because that's often where there's a disconnect. You know, I thought I was going to get, or, you know, so managing that really, really important. And just a seed, if it's something to bring up a little later, but protecting against that centralized tendency of where we keep going back to our cognitive bias is the power of peer review and what that means and how we build that in with the agreement of the client. Yeah. So maybe we could circle back on that.
Well, go for it, because that's actually a point we haven't really touched on, because, you know, there's obviously been a lot of discussion about peer review, particularly around resource estimates for all the right reasons. And, you know, we need to build that in. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, you know, I've always said to people when I've explained the power of peer review is that for a few percent, you know, whatever that might be, you know, 3, 5, 10% of the cost, having the right peer review or peer reviewers, depending on the complexity of the project, adds 100% to the project value. You've got that second set of eyes. They're the critical thinker. They questioning you. They could act as a bridge with the client from that point of view of trust, independence, second eye on the prize. I think it's so valuable. And sometimes I think peer review is used as a, you know, just-in-time peer review rather than a concurrent peer review. And the power of a concurrent peer review by the right people and including them in the feedback loop where the client can feel, you know, I've got someone else on my side, I just think makes such a difference and can protect against that bias.
That's interesting. And maybe, Andrew, how are you guys working with that on your side? Because, you know, I always joke I've never worked for a consultancy, so I wouldn't have a clue what I'm doing. I'm just making it up as I go. But it made more sense to me to have a more collaborative approach to every job that we do. And I think that a lot of our peers are, and it depends obviously on the job and how many people are involved. But if it's a resource estimate, for instance, one person could do that, but on our side, it would probably be 5 or 6 people constantly drifting in and out of the room. And it would be, a little bit of me, it would be a little bit of our geostatisticians, it would be a little bit of our data people. And then suddenly Frank might wander in to just add a bit of wisdom to the actual, mineral system and the mineralogy and so on. And there isn't a real, somebody might own it, but we make a real point out of that internally. Now, that does create a shitload of chaos because you constantly have people walking in and out of every room, but sometimes not physical rooms. But how do you work on that on your side with, you've got offices in various places?
Well, I think firstly, peer review is so fundamentally important to all project and all work. Yeah, that it needs to be an essential part of any project and consulting assignment. And I think, Mark touched on one of the points earlier that if, the consulting teams get immersed in projects, so they're not always then completely unbiased in terms of, and they'll make decisions along the way that also then, trying to get great outcomes and everything, but everyone makes mistakes. That's the bottom line. So to have, an experienced eye cast over the work, and this isn't just at the back end of the project, this is throughout, just to make sure that there's nothing fundamentally missed, that everything's in the right direction, everything's in good order, so that you're going to get a good outcome is really important, because that cognitive bias creeps into every project. And, there's even, the potential there for consultants that are working with the clients trying to deliver exactly what they want. Also to just cast that independent eye over it, just to make sure that, it's all in good order and ultimately you're going to get the right outcome and that someone's going to be able to sign off on it.
And that maybe leads me to kind of a follow-up question, because, from a governance perspective for consultancies, right? And I'm not quite sure about your governance structures. I know Mark talking to you about, SRK and XSTRACT before. and we've obviously served on the same board before. So, but how do you look at risks, either in the past or currently? What are you trying to protect yourself against, and what can you protect yourself against? Because there is, a lot of consultancies have been sued in the past. I don't know the details of any of it, and I hope I'll never have to go through it myself. It must be pretty difficult technically to cover yourself on all bases against risk here. Is there something that you've learned along the way? Maybe to start with you, Tarrant, what and not to bring up experiences here because that wouldn't be the right thing to do, but what kind of have you picked up along the way to sort of buffer yourself against, things going wrong? Because as Andrew says, people make mistakes, and sometimes you just got to own up to those. We had a mistake 3-4 years ago where I think, sorry, mea culpa. But some of these things, as far as I know from things happened in the past with a few companies here and there, have caused some major grief. How do you protect yourself there?
Well, I think the first one step is in peer review. I think the other thing is in your, like the report, you need to make sure that you clearly document the risks and things like that relating to the project, that you're not just presenting an unbiased, or a biased view of the world. There are still these uncertainties that exist, that exist in reality, right? And really it comes down to your processes, right? So if anything ended up coming back in the future, there are, I guess, the possibilities of errors or small errors or whatever. But if you've gone through the process that you've documented to be able to protect from those, I think that's the key thing. All you can do is put in place the things that support quality, right? And making sure that they don't get missed. You could do everything that you can. I think that's the main. That's the main thing that you can do. Even if those errors happen, you followed the process that would reduce or mitigate those things from happening.
Yeah, Mark, any experiences from your end?
Well, I see it as part of a few topics. So I guess the commercial and contracting side of things, and making sure that you're not accepting liability or conditions that could come back and bite you for the type of project you took on. Like, make sure you've got a really good professional looking at whether the contract's fit for purpose is important. I term some activities I do, I call them technical assurance, which is really that peer review looking at the best possible outcome. Have we got the right people using information the right way, using systems that are, proven and suitable for the process? And if we've got the right people with the right processes in the right tools, we'll more likely than not at least tend towards a robust outcome. And I call that technical assurance. And, having that different lens, it's not just technical over data. And if I, model the data correctly, have I got the right model, but just step back and be able to illustrate and defend, in a way provide evidence that you've got those other elements in place. And then that goes back to, I think, Tarrant, you're reflecting really on the due diligence defense, right? Would somebody else with the same data, same information, same knowledge, more likely than not come up with the same outcome, which is a protection for us as professionals. And I've definitely seen that in action in litigation cases, and in general find in favor of the consultants rather than the complainant.
Interesting. Yeah. And maybe as a change of gear here, which is or topic for that matter, unless you guys want to come back to this, I think I've sort of we've kicked this around enough, but, listening to you talk there, do you see consulting as do you see this, whatever that means, right? I actually always hate the term. I find it's a little bit charged, I just like to be a problem solver and just a partner or whatever, wanky term you can throw at it. But let's just use consulting, I guess. Is it changing at all? Are we still stuck in the 1960s ways of providing a service, or are you guys with your businesses actually seeing a change in how people interact and how projects get completed and what our role is in that? Because, when you were speaking earlier, Tarrant, I think we're all pretty passionate about what we do, right? And how we lead our companies and what we try and get out of it. But, we are there to help others. So we're relying on the industry around us. Do you see, maybe to start with you, Andrew, do you guys see any changes, anything interesting along the horizon if you look 20 years ahead and you sit around the board table making plans? I mean, what does consulting look like in the next 20 years for you guys?
I think it has changed a lot. And there's a number of reasons, but, just in general, there's been a loss of experience across the industry. And typically now, you're seeing, a lot of the people coming through the mining companies and through the industry probably don't get the same technical grounding that they used to get. So you're often dealing with, groups that perhaps less experienced and sometimes don't know what they don't know as well. So I think a lot of the knowledge in the industry now actually resides with the consulting groups. So I think that's one big change, and there is, there's a lot of great talent coming into the industry now and through in the last little while, but there's a gap there in that mid-career professionals within the industry. Right. And that's something that's not going to go away and is going to impact on the industry for the next 10, 20 years. I think the other thing was, probably another significant change, and one of many others, but it tends to be less projects where, one group's or one's doing the whole of the project. So that multidiscipline, but consultants, other service providers and clients, it tends to be more of a collaborative effort on projects these days. It's much more common for one group to be doing the resource model and someone else is doing the mine planning and someone else is doing the metallurgy. It's interesting that the software probably doesn't all talk as well together as what it used to at one point in time as well. So, I've certainly seen quite a few gaps, coming through because of that, and that opportunity potentially for that collaboration between the geologists and the mining engineers and the processing engineers is probably more limited than what it used to be as well. So just probably a couple of observations in terms of some of those silos have started creeping back into the industry a little bit more.
Yeah. Tarrant, what do you think?
I think back to 15 or so years ago, and how much has changed in consulting in terms of talking about like resource and reserve related consulting, that we're all in that space. I think the heightened, I think there's a lot more awareness and appreciation of the compliance piece, that we all must, that we must follow. So I think in each of our engagements, the engagements are probably similar in style, or the relationship with the client, probably with the difference of procurement, right? So the one of the biggest challenges that we have in the business is that we are all technical people, right? We love working on the technical projects and solving problems, but getting to the start line is, I think, much harder than it was, say, 15 years ago or 10 years ago, and only getting harder, as we go on. So there's a lot more, friction in that. Like ideally, what we want to do is somebody wants something done. We want to start on Monday. Great, let's start on Monday. Like no better day to start. But if that has to go through procurement and it might take weeks or months, then that does cause a lot of problems, both for clients and and our own businesses as well, because it's much harder to manage our resourcing and things like that. So I see that as one of the biggest trends or challenges that we have in our industry and dealing with that as well.
Yeah, well, and we, whether we keep this in or throw it out, I don't know. We'll see where we go. But the controversial person in me wants to then go straight to the fact that, hey, man, somebody's got to pay for all of that time, right? And I sometimes feel people don't always know what goes on behind the walls to put, I always joke, I don't have a basement with 100 consultants that are chained, and when I press a button and on Monday at 9 o'clock they come out and they start on that job, right? We play this constant hedging game of all of those variables, right? The hurry up and waiting game, as we lovingly call it here. And it is what it is. It's not because of bad planning on the other side, but I do sometimes feel that the justification for that isn't, or the appreciation for the time. You need to have people looking at the contracts and dealing with the business development, and all that stuff sits in the rates. I've been fascinated about the rates principle in our industry. I mean, I saw a post the other day that, this year, the gold companies in particular, the difference between an ounce sold and the cost for an ounce has doubled pretty much, right? I'm sure you've seen the same post, because it's sort of getting a lot of attention. So now, all that money needs to finally go back to shareholders, and finally dividends need to get paid, and finally shares need to be bought back, and some discipline needs to come back in. I get that. But, I do feel that, and I'm not looking for sympathy, so I've got to be very careful how I frame this, but it's pretty tricky to run a consultancy, right? I mean, you can't have 100% utilization. It just doesn't work like that. And all of that needs to come from somewhere. So, I find it increasingly difficult indeed with the current, and I can't quite frame why that is on my side. So I was interested in your thoughts on that. But yeah, there's a lot of toing and froing and a lot of constant background noise before you finally get going on that job, and then you're already fairly decently committed in terms of cost. Mark, any experience from your end there, or is this another Rene rant?
No, it's very topical, and it would be interesting, for Andrew and Tarrant to comment. But generally, the sort of amount of let's call it admin time that's that's built into whether you've added it in as a line item or whether you've built it into your charge out rates. And you think of the amount of compliance, contracting, complexity, the amount of time it takes to get through a new contract when it's not previously accepted terms and conditions. And yet we probably still build in a very similar amount of time or general expenses into our numbers, when in fact it's probably, gone up from 5, 10 to 15% extra time required, or time, I won't say time expended, right? So that's very true. If we're in this new compliance world, how do we cost it? How do we pay for it? And should it be more transparent? Should it be more transparent rather than hidden in our rates? Whatever that means, I think that's important. I wanted to just reflect back, if it's okay, Rene, to the, how do consultants change? I think when you look at the new way of doing business, where we're using data smarter, faster, turning around information more quickly, even in our space, we're using our tools differently to before, and it's a trend that'll carry on. The filter at the end is still, how do you know that was right? What's that experience? Comes back either to peer review, or who's your experienced people in the business that are going to sign off on that work and put the reality check in. And articles in the public around applications of AI related business activity still say, without saying where those experienced people are coming from, is that the experience filter at the end to make that final judgment that the results are appropriate and fit for purpose. None of them say where that experienced person is going to come from. Yep. So to the extent that we can develop them, keep them, retain them in our consultancies, I think that will be a value add at a premium space. And as consultancies, we need to, just have that strategic discussion over, is the way we consulted for the previous, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 5 years ago, the way we want to do it in 5 years, 10 years? Or do we need to change the business? What's going to be our secret sauce that and it's going to change, right? All of us will fill a different niche, but I think it's going to be really important, right? Knowledge used to rest with people, and now we're going to try and build knowledge into databases, and then how do we access it? How do we filter it? So I think there'll be changes, but there's room for traditional, there's room for smart. Sometimes we're going to not necessarily have it in our own businesses. How are we going to work with that? So change is there. We just need to make a decision.
Well, I feel, listening to that, I feel we are under some pressure there as consulting companies, because the bigger companies and the salary packages, I mean, it's lifestyle and just being pure barking mad to pick a job like this up sometime, right? Because it's and I think that difference is going to get trickier, and the fact that, as Andrew just said, in terms of the skills shortages as well, with people retiring, it's already pretty hard to find. It's incredibly competitive out there, and the market is getting smaller. And in terms of salaries as well, if you want to find the best talent, yes, people are not motivated by money, but I definitely do feel some stretch there in places that is where the gaps are difficult to fill. So I do feel personally, if I reflect the question on myself, that we have a little bit of a challenge ahead of us. And maybe Andrew, if you want to further comment it, go for it. But as an extension to that question, obviously there's a lot happening in consulting space as well. A lot of companies are getting sold. That's changing the culture of we can list off a number of companies, a lot of transactions in the last few years. That's also contributing to how this works, because all those consultants getting absorbed by larger, companies, that changes how they work, because they want margins, and how you deal with quality with your small consultancy is out the door. So, I do feel a bit of a changing landscape. Andrew, you want to come back to any of that, or?
Yeah, I think just touching on that, the talent pool, I guess one of the really encouraging things is that, with the mechanization, the expansion of, the professional bodies into other jurisdictions, the amount of talent in some of those emerging mining regions is increasing significantly. From a practical experience, wasn't that long ago, we opened offices in South Africa. We've always done a lot of work there, but the amount of talent that's there, in terms of, and the experience they've gained now with, particularly things like Australian contractors, Byrnecut, Minco operating in those jurisdictions, they're used to seeing modern mechanised mining and using all the tools. So, if there's lots of places now where you can go and find, a lot of, good young talent in the industry. So that is being offset to a degree, and certainly with the shortage in places like Australia, Canada, that's pretty encouraging as well.
Do you see, either for yourself and maybe for Tarrant, do you guys see more of your consultants in the future coming not out of Australia, coming from different parts of the world, or is it already something that you're tapping into, different markets?
I think it's a mix. I think it's great to have people with that mix of skill base and experiences and things like that as well. And it makes the world smaller. One of the great things about consulting is the extensive range of different projects that you get to work on and the great places you get to visit. That's you can't get that with most mining companies. But
true.
What do you think, Tarrant?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think it's a mix. Like, I wish we could hire more of like there's some people that you meet and you say, hey, you would be just amazing, at doing this job, but that for the situation they're in, that's probably just it's just not going to work, for them, financially. Unfortunately, we don't sell, we don't sell gold bullion, right? We sell hours, and the margins that we make are not what the gold companies make at the moment. Yeah. So I wish we had, something to roll out for that. Obviously, as Andrew said, there are good, selling points for it. I think there's obviously pockets, right? And I think particularly for consultants who are moving out of less full-time employment or, professionals, consulting is a great way of staying as part of a team and being able to, live your lifestyle but contribute. And to me, those experienced people might not be so valued by mining companies, right? Yeah. But to me, they're like gold, because they're the people that try to ensure that quality. And for me, the longer they can hang on before they fully retire, the better. Yeah. I think in terms of the new people coming through, I mean, there aren't a lot of graduates in Australia, but, there are in other jurisdictions, and people moving around. I spend a lot of time with professionals in Brazil, and they're fantastic. Professionals all around the world. There's quality people. There's no different. Okay. And so I think there are places where we can look and opportunities that you can give people, to move around the world in a global, network as the businesses that we operate, that were people that would enjoy that challenge. So I think it's like any business is challenging, trying to find the right fit,
yes, of course,
of person and company, right? And time.
Yeah. Now challenges galore. I think that's what's making it interesting for us as well. In any year that you plan, you don't know where it's going to go. You don't know what challenges are coming your way and what the industry will be doing. We woke up this morning to a gold price that is crazy, and I'm sure the phones will start ringing, and we just deal with whatever comes our way. But look, gentlemen, I think we'll draw to a close, but maybe we could do it again over a beer when we're all together in the same place. But I find it really interesting to talk to you guys. I found it definitely covered a bit of ground. And any final words of wisdom or anything that I haven't quite picked up, whether it's the original topic or otherwise, that you have on the table?
I think it's interesting when I reflect back on sort of my career journey and 25 plus years in the consulting game. Yeah. There obviously was something that one really enjoyed about it. It's in our DNA, those of us that gravitate towards it. it does reinvent itself, and people, we reinvent ourselves within what we call more broadly consulting. So I think we just have to have that, that flexibility. But coming back to the topic on hand, Rene, I think, challenging ourselves about that, potential strategic misrepresentation, the central tendency. I think that's where we add the value to clients' projects if we continually question ourselves and seek to add dimensions beyond the routine.
Yeah, no, well said, Mark. That's any closing comments from yourself, Andrew?
And I agree. If you look at, in sometimes consultants, get a bad name and there's some negative sentiment. But if you actually look at where a lot of the expertise, the depth of experience and knowledge, and a lot of the things that are driving innovation is actually coming from the consulting groups.
Right.
And that process is fast tracked because you're working on lots of projects.
Yeah.
So you get a chance to sort of learn quickly and continue to develop things. So, that's great. It's a great profession to get in, but great contributions to the professional bodies and everything else that's that's come from consulting teams. So, been very lucky to have learnt from some of the best in the business throughout my career, and it is a great place to learn your own skills and develop and contribute to the industry.
Yeah, and maybe, Tarrant, before you get the final word here, I mean, that's what I enjoy about even this interaction, right? I find it, I see a lot of you guys as colleagues, and we're all trying to do the same thing. I've learned a lot from Mark over the years, and always watch what you guys are doing, and others out there as well. Collaboration is something that I put on the list to discuss, but that might have to be for another time. And for others, perhaps looking in, consultants are not just, robots that you send to solve a problem. There's some real passion there, and that's what I'm hearing here as well. We're all sitting here because we really enjoy what we're doing, so that's nice. Tarrant, final say?
Yeah, look, in terms of the strategic misrepresentation, I think the comments that everybody's made is kind of is spot on. I think it's the client relationships and how you cultivate them through being transparent and communicating, as early as possible. And I think that's about, the best you can do. And I think, I'd echo the sentiments on consulting, I think in general we do it because we love it, right? And we enjoy the challenge every day and helping clients, and being a part of a larger consulting company, gives you a platform to be able to talk, about solving these problems, trying to improve the industry bit by bit, project by project. I was in research at one time, and I found that being in consulting was the best way to actually develop new ideas, because you got them every day. So over 20 years, I've been involved in 400, 500 different projects. You see different commodities, you see how things, regions, you see how things work. So it's a really fantastic industry to be a part of 100%. For those that it works for. And I think hopefully our clients can see, that all of us are trying to do a good job, right? We're trying to deliver to the budget, the budgets, the scopes. The scopes are sometimes hard to understand. So hopefully there's that give and that relationship on both sides, where we all know we're trying to achieve what they want to achieve. We've still got a business that we've got to pay our people just like they do as well. So let's come together and work towards a good solution. So.
Yeah. Look, that's a great summary, and thanks for running with this, guys. I know it was a little bit of spur of the moment, but I really appreciate you making the time for this. I'll close it out there, but I'm sure we'll chat again sometime, because I can think of a number of other interesting topics to cover. But thanks so much, and also to you, Mark, for waking up very early. Appreciate it, and I'm sure I'll catch up with you sometime around the globe, and look forward to it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
See ya.